Pleasure to introduce today Professor Rao, Professor Narasimha Rao. Professor Rao is of our own here at YSC. His research examines the relationship between energy systems, human development, and climate change. He's the recipient of a European Research Council grant for a project called Decent Living Energy that examines the energy and emissions thresholds for providing decent living standards for all around the world. His research interests also include investigating income inequality, infrastructure, and climate policy, using methods such as household energy modeling, econometrics, input-output analysis, and policy analysis. He's also a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Luxembourg, Austria. His PhD is from Stanford, also has master's from MIT and a bachelor's from Dartmouth, and is becoming a real leader in the world of global energy justice. And so we're really pleased to have him here to offer to give us a talk about global energy justice. Thank you very much, Professor Rao.
I'm going to demask since I'm safe distance away from everyone. Good afternoon. Really nice to be here and see a lot of familiar faces. I'm actually very glad that you've pulled this course together and giving attention to an extremely important topic. And so looking forward to the discussion with you. So I've seen that you've had a good set of sessions so far and really understood or gaining a good understanding of energy poverty, mostly in the US, and understanding its impacts as well on human well-being, including on health, through things like air pollution and other channels. And so I thought what I'd like to do today is to complement that in two ways. One of them, I thought I'd like to broaden your perspective to look at energy poverty more broadly across the world. I think arguably you have circumstances that are more dire in other parts of the world in terms of the deprivations, as well as the scale of the deprivations across, particularly in the global south. So give you a sense of the conditions of energy poverty around the world. The second objective I have is a little more provocative. I think you've probably spent a lot of time gaining an understanding of what energy poverty is, and I want to make you think about solutions. So how do we really think about normatively what we're aiming for in eradicating energy poverty? And I think in doing that, we need to go a little bit back to first principles. What do we care about in the first place that makes us want to eradicate energy poverty, and how do we guide policy? How do we set different targets for what we want to achieve? We know what we don't want, but it's not so clear, besides the obvious, what we are actually trying to achieve in terms of eradicating energy poverty. And of course, I'll put that in terms of the context of global justice. So I'm going to start at the outset with a few key messages that I want to get across to you in the context of household energy poverty, which I think is the primary focus in this course. The first is that energy poverty is a persistent impediment to human progress worldwide. I think it'll resonate with you when you see what I show you in terms of the number of people that are affected and the kinds of deprivations we see. It'll be quite clear that this is an important impediment to raising well-being all over the world. So that's a fairly straightforward message. But I'm going to suggest that now when we think in terms of normative solutions, that the policy solutions that we have today, they lack ambition. They lack sufficient ambition. And I'm speaking a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 7 and its formulation of the energy access targets. But not just that, even when you think about national policies and targets, I don't think we know what we're doing in some sense, in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And part of the reason for that lack of ambition and in developing targets and standards is I don't think we have a normative frame with which to set targets. And so I think this is going back to first principles. Even in theory, I don't think we really know how to set targets for energy poverty. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that energy poverty is very fundamentally a part of, and therefore must be viewed as, one dimension of overall poverty. So for example, if you're thinking about energy expenditure burdens, right, which you probably encountered a lot, how do you decide what is an appropriate burden? How do you think about that? And I would argue that it's almost impossible to think about it without abstracting away from energy expenditure to look at the broader context of poverty, as one example. And there's many other examples of that. So those are the key messages I want to communicate through my presentation. And in addition to that, I want to expand beyond household energy services. So we largely view energy access and energy poverty in terms of the services people receive in the house, in the household, in the home. And I would argue that energy is required for every human activity. And if we need to think about energy and its importance for eradicating poverty more broadly, we have to think about energy use outside the household as well. You know, we need energy for healthcare, for hospitals, for schools, for industry to produce the products that we consume. And to the extent those are essential for our human well-being, then we need to think about the energy needs to provide those goods and services. So I want to spend the last chunk of my presentation thinking about what I would call, say, national or societal energy poverty, not just individual or household energy poverty, and think about energy needs beyond the household. Now, I wanted to start by just giving some background about why do we care, right? So let's look at the literature on what the impact of energy deprivations are, or if providing energy access is on people. And that's a good starting point for us to think about normatively what we care about in terms of the end goals of policy. So this is a very nice synthesis of the literature, and this is empirical evidence that has been gathered over the course of many years, decades actually, looking at household electricity access and consumption, and the impact people have actually measured on different aspects of life. You know, so education, quality of life, increased income, communication, access to information, household productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these bars are telling us the percent of studies that showed an impact. The purple is showing a positive impact. The blue is showing no impact, as an inconclusive in terms of the studies shown. So for example, we see that education is an extremely important impact, and we find that 50% of studies are showing that there's a positive impact on education from providing people with access to electricity and lighting. Things like comfort in the home, time of use is another important dimension where people, women, for example, have much less time that they have to devote to chores, like washing clothes when you have access to a washing machine, or a mechanical device to grind flour if you're going to, you know, make basic food products at home. And so these are the different dimensions, and we can start to think about, okay, if these are the factors we care about in terms of well-being, then we can start to think about where energy is instrumental to provide those services. And then that provides us a mechanism for justifying why we think we need energy services in order to maximize human well-being, for example. Another thing it makes you think about is, well, what are the mechanisms by which energy access is enabling these different services? So in the case of education, it's pretty straightforward. We found that just by providing lighting from an electric bulb as opposed to kerosene, or a wax candle, that you can actually, children can actually read and do homework in the evenings. And that's something you can't otherwise do under a kerosene lamp very well. So that's a pretty straightforward mechanism, but it's a pretty modest target for energy access to just think about lighting. If you think about quality of life and comfort in the home, perhaps that's also straightforward, but when you start to think about increased income, gender equality, and providing other benefits like cost savings, health impacts, it's a little bit more complicated in terms of what are the mechanisms by which we're impacting these different dimensions, and what is the nature of the energy services that have to be provided to ensure that we are able to get those benefits out of them. And so that's one step towards thinking about normatively about energy access and services that we want. We can also think at a macro scale. More broadly, a lot of people have studied at a national level how does energy consumption relate to different metrics of well-being at a national scale. So, for example, in the latest IPCC report, they've put together a correlation between the Human Development Index and energy consumption, per capita energy use, and looking separately at different levels of electrification. And you do find that there is a positive relationship. You do find that at low levels of human development, you see increased amount of energy use has a disproportionately high correlation to increases in the Human Development Index. And again, it makes us think about provision of energy services beyond just the household. one can think about it also as an enabler of income generation. The provision of energy services allows you to operate machines, start new industry, and the infusion of capital allows economic growth. And so people are extremely interested in thinking about energy as an enabler of infrastructure development and economic growth. But in order to think about it at this macro scale, we need to understand, well, how much energy and in what forms of services do we need to enable these kinds of changes, because we know that these are also bidirectional, that they also reflect a level of standard of living and don't just generate it. Okay, so with those broad objectives in mind, I want to turn to the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is, the policy targets that we're working with in the last 7 years or so. The Sustainable Development Goal 7 targets providing access to clean cooking to everybody and access to electricity. So this is literally just a binary indicator of whether or not people have access. And it's interesting to know the genesis of this target, actually, to understand why it is what it is. But in the development of the Millennium Development Goals up to 2000, there was a lot of talk about the fact that if we want to improve sanitation to people, provide water access, it's hard to do it in places where people don't have energy supply. And so it kept coming up that we lack energy services in places we want to further other goals. And so they came up with, after a lot of debate, a goal specifically for energy, and that was a real progress. But because you don't have data on a lot of the energy services provided in different countries, they chose a target that was measurable and verifiable and reportable, basically whether or not you're connected or not. And so we have the most rudimentary target for energy access, which is, just a binary connection. And that doesn't tell you very much. Nevertheless, if you look at the progress in those particular targets, there are about 1 billion people in 2010 who didn't have access to electricity. And we've made a lot of progress, bringing that down to 800 to 760. And the change in the transformation and technology has enabled this to some extent. So there have been something like 25 to 26,000 mini grids in the last decade that have been built in mostly Africa and Asia, built with solar battery hybrid systems, usually standalone and mini grid. And these have served something like 50 million people and are now the cheapest option. Okay, so that has been a lot of progress, but we don't know much about what people have done with that connection. We don't know what services they've been able to afford. We don't know how expensive they are. We don't know how scalable they are. In the case of clean cooking, we have not seen as optimistic a story. We've seen barely much progress because population growth just continues to outpace progress in clean access. But nevertheless, this is a problem that is also concentrated in certain parts of the world. You'll see that the light-colored areas are the areas of the world where you have very limited access to clean cooking in rural areas. It's also interesting that Central America, which may be surprising to some people, also has a very large share of biomass burning for cooking. And if you look in terms of population, you'll find that the bulk of people who are in rural areas without access to clean cooking are concentrated in 2 countries. So more than half of the 2.5 billion people you'll find are in China and India alone. And that's important only to indicate that the policies that are in those 2 countries, governance is extremely important in order to ensure that you make significant progress in these targets. Why do we care so much about clean cooking? Well, burning solid fuels for cooking causes air pollution, which is equivalent to women and children sitting in a kitchen and smoking cigarettes. That's the extent of air pollution. And in certain parts of the world, residential use of cooking fuel dominates in terms of the source of air pollution. So particulate matter is contributed by various activities, but in certain parts of the world where you have very large amounts of wood or coal being burnt, you have high levels of air pollution. It's also the case that women spend hours collecting firewood in addition to the hours they spend collecting water for water supply. And so there's a significant time of use issue here that also inhibits their further development in many other respects. So what are the impacts have been on women? Well, we've seen a literal increase in mortality. So something like 7 million people a year, mainly women and children, die due to burning solid fuels. And if you look at the progress over time, this is in Africa and in Asia we actually have seen significant reductions in the amount of disability adjusted life years without necessarily significant improvements in the percentage of people having access to clean cooking, which is to suggest that there are other factors that influence women's health. It's also nutrition, access to other health facilities. And so this, again, I want to point you to the idea that when we look at the metrics associated with the energy deprivation, so indoor air pollution, it's not just clean cooking that we need to target. There's many other aspects of policy that are influencing our progress. It has also been the case that clean cooking has been a laggard among all the different utilities that have been provided in different parts of the world. So if you look at the green line, this is showing you the progress in those who have access to clean cooking fuels, and they tend to be the lowest, both in absolute terms and as well in terms of progress. And it's a little unfortunate that the utilities that have the most direct impact on human health, and particularly women, have the least priority. And one can only speculate as to why that's the case, but it could be that with electricity, there's so many knock-on effects on economic development and growth that there's a lot more priority given to that. But it's only speculation. The point is that it's a persistently lagging service, and so an extremely important one to address. What do we aim for in terms of solutions? By and large, there are three types of solutions that people have focused on. One of them is to improve the type of stove where you burn solid fuels, but this has had a history of failure, essentially, where for a couple of decades, we haven't really effectively improved air pollution with these stoves, and we haven't had people really use them on a sustained basis. So really, the solution that most countries have embraced is liquid petroleum gas, that's LPG. And I think that the fuel of future needs to be electricity, and I'm going to show you why it's a little bit of a concern that we have LPG as a target. One of the reasons is that providing people with affordable stoves is not enough, because the fuel costs tend to dominate the overall cost of using cooking stoves. And so we've found in our work that if we look at the uptake of cooking stoves, so this is a study that's been done in India, there's been a tremendous amount of increase in the number of people who use LPG in a government program where they just provided them for free. So we provided people with a cook stove as well as one free cylinder, and saw a tremendous uptake in one region of India. But then if you look at the amount of cylinders that were then subsequently purchased, those don't match at all the rate of uptake of new cylinders, which is to say that people took this first cylinder, they got the stove, but they found the fuel too expensive, and so they continued to use the old stoves. And so you have this phenomenon of fuel stacking where people just are going to use the cheapest fuel accessible to them, which is biomass, and you don't really achieve your goal of energy access because just providing the cook stove for free is not good enough. So this is one enhancement to the idea of energy access, which is how do we provide affordable fuel to people? When we consider the fact that we're moving towards a world where carbon might be taxed, then that poses an additional challenge, because with LPG, energy prices go up and people may be disincented from using gas even further. And so we did a study where we calculated people's demand response to different fuel prices in order to assess what would happen if you added a carbon price to fuel prices. And so we looked at the percentage of people who would get off of dirty cook stoves with rising incomes over time. And then we added a fuel price surcharge for carbon and found that it reverses a lot of the progress that you make in energy access with a carbon price in India, equivalent to a value you would need to achieve a 2 degrees target. So there's a concern here that you can push people back into energy poverty from increasing energy prices. Now, this is not necessarily the case. There are ways to protect people from these increases, but it's a concern. So overall, electricity, interestingly, doesn't have the same vulnerability, because we have other substitutes for making electricity besides fossil fuels. And so we find that in the future, even if you have a carbon tax, the prices of electricity may not increase so much because of substitutes such as solar and wind for electricity production. So I think, and our view is that electricity is the future cook stove, but that poses a whole new set of concerns about the readiness of homes to be able to adopt a high energy intensity appliance. But a lot of research still needs to be done on that. It's an important direction that we need to go. And then one might ask the question, is providing an electricity connection enough? And there's some interesting studies done in Africa that have looked at, similar to gas, after a certain number of months since people have acquired a connection, how much electricity do they consume? And they found that over the course of several years after they have a connection, their consumption barely increases. And so we're talking about consumption levels that are the equivalent of 1 or 2 days of consumption in the US. Why is it that people's electricity consumption is not increasing? Well, they probably don't have access to appliances. They can't afford the appliances that would need electricity. So it makes you think that not only do we care about providing electricity access, but how do we make the appliances that provide the services affordable as well? So air conditioning, refrigerators, and other appliances are important to make affordable as well. One example of that is cooling. Heat stress is known now to have caused over 500 million heat exposure events in the last 20 years. And in that time, we've had the percentage of mortality in older people above 65 years increasing by 50%. And over 290,000 people have died from heat stress just in the last 20 years. And these are concentrated in certain parts of the world where you have energy poverty as well. And so we've done work to characterize how many people would be exposed to heat stress and not be able to afford an air conditioner in different parts of the world, and found again that the relationship to poverty is extremely strong, that in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, people are unlikely to have the means to be able to afford air conditioning and therefore avoid heat stress. And we found that that number of people far exceeds those who lack an electricity connection. So this is well beyond the issue of having access to electricity. So this is only one example of a service that we care about providing with energy access that we're not really considering. And there are many others as well, refrigeration being another one. But we can look beyond the global south, and you find that even in Europe, we have energy poverty of the kind you've probably encountered in previous classes. So this is a number of households, the share of households in different European countries that have been unable to pay to keep their homes adequately warm. And this is the similar share of households across countries in Europe that have reported the presence of leaks, damp, or rot, meaning they don't have the ability to maintain humidity at levels that avoid these phenomena. So this is not just a global south issue. This has a lot to do with the housing conditions that people live in. That is, the housing stock that exists are in many cases over a century old, and they just don't have the ability to insulate the home properly and therefore keep heating and cooling costs within reasonable bounds. And so even in Europe, you have this persistent issue that a good share of households are not able to receive services that they need for basic well-being. And then beyond that, I think the question we've been asking a lot is, in the US, is about energy burdens and expenditure burdens. And this is where I want you to think about normatively. How do we say what is the appropriate burden for people to bear in terms of energy costs? Should we think about it in terms of absolute terms? That is, people ought not to bear more than 10% of their income on energy, spend not more than 10%. That seems to be a rule of thumb that people are using without much basis, really. Or we might think of it in relative terms, that people ought to not spend a certain share above the median household in a society. And you might think about energy costs, not just for the household, but for transport as well. You find that this is a study in France that shows that people of different income deciles, a large share of them are spending money on transport well in excess of the median household. And so we might ask the question, do we want to set a standard for how much people spend based on the average person or the median person? This is the amount of commuting time people spend in the US comparing white folks to people of color. There's a consistent pattern of people of color spending more time in commuting than white folks. So we ask questions of systematic discrimination in the services we provide to people that lead them to have different levels of commuting time or different amounts of transportation costs. And so we don't really know yet how we think about energy expenditure burdens. If we think about it in absolute terms instead of relative terms, then we have to think about all the other expenditures people have to bear in order to meet their basic needs. And so this is a whole bunch of numbers, you don't have to look at it, but in different countries in the world, if you compare the total costs for spending, for meeting people's basic needs, it differs quite widely across different countries. And you find countries that may have a fairly reasonable energy burden. So if you look at Bangladesh, if you look at their total expenditures on transport, food, and energy, it's much higher than a country like Thailand, which has a much higher energy burden at 10%, but their overall expenditure burden, or sort of their means on food, transport, and energy, is a lot less. And so it raises the question, if we're ultimately interested in disposable income, then it's not so important just to look at energy expenditures. It's important to look at your total amount of expenditure you're spending on your basic needs and look at what disposable income you have above that. And so that's why we have to look beyond people's energy expenditure to think about what is a fair, a reasonable expense on a total package of basic needs and not just on a single service. I talked about the mini grids that have been serving energy poverty in the last decade. The average cost of those services have been approximately 50 cents per kilowatt hour, which is pretty high. And so you could also think about it in terms of the cost of supply. Right? How expensive should electricity access be? Because it may not be possible to scale in the future if it's going to be extremely expensive for people. So there's multiple ways we can think about an expenditure burden, and we don't really have a clear guidance as to how we might do that. So in just abstracting away from these specific numbers, what I've done is I've shown you different conditions, different ways in which we may think about energy deprivations, money or services. And in order to think about the solutions, I think we need to ask the question, what entitlements are we seeking? Like, what are we trying to get from policy? And we may think about this in terms of who ought to bear that obligation, who ought to provide that entitlement. Because if you're going to speak of justice claims, we need to think about an entity that has the obligation to meet those claims. So if we talk about access to energy supply as the entitlement we seek, then the policies need to be targeted towards energy utilities in terms of developing standards for the kind of quality of service and the cost of supply. But if we're thinking about what is an affordable energy service, well, then it goes beyond thinking of just the cost of supply. It goes to also the cost of appliances and goes to fundamentally people's levels of income. If you think about the examples in Africa, perhaps the solution to improving energy access and services has nothing to do with energy supply. It actually just has to do with raising incomes. And so we really have to think broadly about what solutions we desire. I mentioned with heat stress that we can't really provide cooling solutions without thinking about the quality of housing. And so we need to think about broader solution sets that include housing, appliances, and fuel. And finally, like I said, ultimately our goal is to think about perhaps a level of minimal disposable income, which again requires that we think beyond basic energy services. So just as an example, the kinds of standards that we need to think about, I think, are something like this as a starting point. So in the case of electricity and, let's say, cooling services, we may define standards for the kind of electricity supply we want that's reliable 24/7, that doesn't endanger people, and that doesn't constrain you in terms of the appliances that you can connect to it. But in order to think about providing people the ability to keep warm in winter and cool in summer, that we have certain standards for comfort in terms of temperature and humidity, and perhaps indoor air quality levels that allow us to think about what technologies would be suitable to meet these services. And finally, we need to determine how do we think about affordability of these services in the context of their overall life and other services. And this is why this is such a complex problem, because for each service, we have different conditions and different contexts. And it's hard to think about solutions in sort of a broad brush way for energy services. So now I want to move to thinking more broadly about energy for meeting people's basic needs more broadly. And first I want to talk about transport, because I think transport kind of falls between the cracks between household energy services and overall energy services for society. because mobility is kind of a bridge between household services and people's broader human needs. You can think about mobility as providing access to jobs, of course, but also to grocery stores, to pharmacies, healthcare services. And so we may not realize that if people don't have adequate and affordable services, it has knock-on effects on the rest of their lives that we don't really consider. People have studied transport-related poverty and categorized it into different kinds. You have mobility poverty, where people just don't have access to motorized services. This speaks to 70% of the global South who actually don't have access to motorized transport, which limits their options and the radius of their lives. We can speak of people who have access to motorized transport, but as I showed you, the level of service people enjoy are very different. And so people have high commuting times in certain areas, and that places a lot of restrictions on the services they can access. And then, of course, you have affordability. And remember that affordability can be a misleading metric, because if you don't enjoy services that you need, you may deprive yourself. Your expenditure shares may actually be low, but that's because you're not enjoying the services that you want in the first place. So a single metric like energy expenditure share can be very misleading. And we have to think about multiple metrics, for example. And then more broadly, the question is, how do you think about the level of energy services that you need in society to provide a broad range of services to people? And this is where I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about what constitutes the material requirements for basic living in order to assess how energy is instrumental to meet those needs. And so we can think about the services that we've talked about in the home that you need. In addition to energy services, you need water and sanitation. Perhaps in a modern society, we need access to the internet and communication infrastructure in order to affiliate with people. So we've actually drawn from quite a depth of literature and philosophy and social policy to think about physical well-being and health, but also social well-being. That is, what do people need to relate to the rest of society, both in terms of physical movement, but also in terms of communication and infrastructure. And we've built up from that infrastructure requirements at the household level, at the community level, so things like hospitals and schools, and as well at the national level. So the backbone infrastructure of cement and steel and roads and electric grids in order to provide these services at different levels. And when we think of that broad hierarchical distribution of infrastructure, then you can start to think more holistically about the energy that you need in a society to power all these services, to build all that infrastructure. And then you can think about the level of energy that societies need to meet everyone's basic needs. So in that vein, you can ask the question, how much energy do nations need to ensure that, that people have access to basic well-being? So this is the broader view of energy justice from the perspective of sort of broader human access to well-being. And there have been many studies in the last 40 years that have tried to quantify this. And I don't want to go through these numbers. It's mainly to point out the fact that this has been a question that has been targeted for 40 years since we've been thinking about energy scarcity from the oil crisis in the 70s. But people have used arbitrary criteria, so an acceptable standard of living, low HDI below some arbitrary threshold. Let's take a sort of average standard of living in Europe as a benchmark. There have been several different approaches that have just not normatively justified what they've sought as a standard for human development. And I think that has been some of the key bottlenecks in trying to identify what kinds of levels of energy we need in order to provide basic services to people. So if you want to look this up further, I have a whole bunch of work on this, and we've created kind of a dashboard of deprivations. This is not energy, these are the deprivations associated with basic well-being and all of the material requirements of well-being in the household and in the community. And for every country in the world, we've identified the percentage of people who lack access to these various services. And from that, we've inferred or calculated the amount of energy that would be required to meet people's basic needs. And you can compare that to income poverty. These blue lines are showing you that for the most part, this multi-dimensional deprivations are far in excess of income poverty. If you consider various levels of income, so at $1 a day and up to $5 a day, if you look at the percentage of people who lack these services compared to the percentage of people who earn less than $5 a day, you find that the former is consistently higher. So in some sense, income poverty is not capturing the full extent of these material deprivations. And so on this basis, based on a few years of work, we've calculated sort of, this is for different regions of the world, South Asia, Africa, Pacific Asia, Latin America, going towards North America here. The total amount of energy consumption, that's the green, that's sort of national energy demand per capita per year. This black dashed line, which is the hypothetical energy requirement that we have calculated would be required for people to meet those material deprivations. And this gray shaded area is what of those basic living standards are actually being served. So what's interesting about this is that in so many parts of the world, the level of consumption of energy today is far in excess of what is required to provide basic needs. And that's even the case in places like South Asia. It's just that it's very unevenly distributed. And so all of this energy that is above this black dotted line up to the green line, we can think of this as affluence. This is energy that serves a set of services beyond just basic well-being. And it's kind of interesting now for us to know that globally, the amount of energy we need to provide basic services to people is actually about a quarter of the amount of energy we consume in the world today. Of course, that's on average. And it's only in places like Africa where there's a big deprivation and the amount of energy you would need hypothetically is almost the level that they're being consuming today. And of course, you have high levels of inequality in those societies as well. So what this tells us is that this is an equity issue to a large extent, that we have a distributive justice issue with energy justice, in that within countries too, we have to think about how we develop energy supply in order to make sure we equitably provide access to services to people. And I just wanted to show that in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we have growth rates that are required to meet these basic needs that are far in excess of what we've seen in history. So it may be a surprise to you, but in sub-Saharan Africa, in the last 20 years, per capita energy has not grown at all on average. Energy supply has grown, but population growth has pretty much matched it. And so that's the only region of concern where we need significant unprecedented growth to build out infrastructure to even meet people's basic needs. This is just showing you historical growth rates versus the necessary growth rates. On this side of the line, you just don't have in history any record of growth rates that would be required to meet these basic needs by 2040. Whereas countries on this side are potentially in a position to be able to eradicate poverty and provide energy to eradicate poverty by 2040. So in that whirlwind presentation, let me just go back to my main messages. In terms of household energy poverty, I've shown you that populations that experience service deprivations in terms of time use, pollution, heat stress, and lack of mobility far exceed the number of people that are not connected. And that I don't think we have enough ambition in the Sustainable Development Goals. They're too narrowly construed as binary indicators, and that we don't really understand energy deprivations and their relationship to well-being, what the actual context is of people's energy conditions, and what their actual experience of well-being is. We don't understand that very well. And until we do that, we won't have a basis to even think about normatively what we want as a solution. And when we do think about standards like energy expenditure or levels of energy services, we have to think of them in the context of poverty, because it's not just the energy supply that's going to influence their experience of those services. Housing conditions matter, the income matters to be able to buy appliances and to generate income that can afford those appliances, and that we also need to look at overlapping vulnerabilities like food deserts and access to healthcare that altogether present an energy burden to people. And at a global level, we have this issue of national energy poverty, where we have found that energy growth seems to be serving affluence more than it is serving poverty eradication. And that the energy needs, this is the only positive spin on this, is the energy needs for eradicating poverty actually are fairly modest if we look at the overall energy use across the world, and even within developing countries. It's only in sub-Saharan Africa we have this concern that we have unprecedented growth requirements in order to eradicate poverty in the near future. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Why don't we begin with questions from the audience?
Surely you have questions. Surely you have questions. Incredibly rich discussion. Yeah.
Thanks. That was great. I had a question about the graph on, I think, 3 or 4 slides ago. That one, yeah. So just trying to understand the graph. So the gap between kind of the red box and the black box is the current like basic energy needs to, I guess, eradicate poverty. Is that the red box? And then the black box is affluence.
Yeah, so this is the extent of energy use that is serving basic needs in the country today.
Oh, current. Okay.
And this is the level of energy that would be required to serve everyone's basic needs. And this is the level of energy that is the total energy demand in the country. So in other words, all of this from the gray box, the red line up to the green line, is serving affluence, but not for everybody in society.
Right.
There are a number of people who are deprived. That's why you have this gap over here. So in some sense, the fact that you have this gap between the black line and the red line shows you there's an inequity in energy use in the regions, in countries. And that's particularly damning in poor countries because there's so many people who lack sufficient energy services, and yet you have a fair amount of energy that's basically serving a minority of the population.
As you try and like push up the red box, I guess, and try and close the gap, with the overall economic development that would go along with that in the country, would that raise the entire, I guess, profile of each box in the graph here?
Yeah, so that's exactly the right question, because people will argue that, hang on a second, every society has inequality. Every society has people who are enjoying luxury energy services and affluence, right? So if you pursue policies to generally grow faster, say, right, and provide more services to everybody, well, you might push up all the lines, right? That may be a reasonable expectation. We can't expect that all of a sudden in sub-Saharan Africa, all future energy growth is going to serve to fill this gap. That would be an unreasonable expectation of policymakers, right? It's that kind of transformation is suggesting you need not just an energy transition, but a sort of a social transformation, where all of a sudden you have an equitable society. So that's unreasonable. So we actually have work where we've tried to look at the trade-off between GDP growth rates, inequality rates, like if you look at Gini coefficients of income, and minimum provisions of income, which you can look at in energy terms also. So what are the trade-offs? If you're limited in terms of reducing inequality just out of practical concerns, how much growth do you need to bring up the minimum level? And so we can play with that analysis to suggest what are the trade-offs between trying to push growth inequitably, or if you were to pursue equitable growth, then how does that release the pressure on overall growth in order to raise to a certain minimum level? And so, yeah, that's exactly the right question to ask in terms of how does this implicate energy policy or national policy? Yeah.
Thanks.
Kyle. Oh, Sarah.
I just had another question on this graph. So I was just surprised looking at this. We know, in the United States, 1 in 3 households has trouble paying their energy bill. So like, how does that factor into this graph?
Yeah, this won't tell you that because this is looking at average levels across the whole country. So basically in the United States, well, North America, what I'm showing here, about 40 to 45 gigajoules per capita would be required for this modest package of services that I've defined earlier, which, by the way, includes a very small amount of floor space, like 10 square meters per capita, right? And the rest of the energy that's consumed in the US serves bigger houses and central air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, that average masks a distribution of energy, with some households not having access to energy. But on average, that's the level that would be required. And also showing you that on average, people, there's enough energy to meet everyone's basic needs for the most part.
So really quick follow-on just on that.
Yeah.
Jesse, else over there. Have you ever seen a version of this graph that breaks it down separately for the lowest income group or the most vulnerable populations within each country versus the average versus the wealthiest? Because that would be quite interesting to see as well. That might break apart which of the countries are closest on average, but maybe far off for some groups within the countries.
Yeah. I mean, we've tried to generate graphs like what you said, but only with hypothetical assumptions because the data just don't exist. So for example, if I talked about different dimensions of deprivations, right? Having access to cooling, adequate transport, housing. We know the percentage of people who lack adequate housing. We know the percentage of people who don't have air conditioners and the percentage of people who don't have cars or any access to transport. But we don't know the cross-section of those, the cross-product of those. The data just don't tell us that. We would need to do that. But the place where we can build that is the US. So as you know, I have this other project where I'm trying to develop, using national surveys in the US, a much more fine, granular picture of multidimensional poverty. And so then we will be able to characterize people who have this particular set of deprivations and associated with the level of energy use. And that would be very, very meaningful. And that's what I'm kind of heading towards. But it's only possible literally for the US. Even in Europe, we don't have adequate granularity in the data to do that.
I'm wondering if you can talk briefly about why the black boxes are different in different areas and whether that is primarily due to like climate or other reasons.
Yeah, that's a great, I was hoping someone would ask that question. So why is it that it's not the same? Well, climate, obviously, it takes generally a lot more energy to keep people at a comfortable temperature in cold climates than it does in hot climates, even if you had adequate access to AC. So that's why in cold countries, you will have a slightly higher requirement. By the way, this requirement that we calculate varies by up to a factor of 3, by the way, in normative conditions, hypothetical conditions. Another reason, and this is a very difficult question, is what infrastructure for transport do you have and allow in the future, right? If you have historically car-dependent economies, the energy intensity of providing the same passenger kilometer is more than double that of Japan, where 40% of the population is served by public transit. So going forward, that's an important policy question and debate. In our calculations for future scenarios, how much do we push the United States and Brazil to move away from a car-dependent economy, which would drop their energy requirement for meeting basic living standards significantly? And conversely, if you look at poor countries, how much do you allow for that current trend of everyone buying a car? And how much do you allow for a leapfrog towards public transportation at an unprecedented level of transformation that you haven't seen in history in other countries, right? So this is the kind of debate that we need to think about and make more vocal, is what kind of transformations you need. And I think this analysis reveals that you need a good look at housing and a good look at transport as some of the key ones in order to really address equity in meeting people's basic living standards.
Hi, I was wondering if you could share like your opinion on viewing electricity as a right where it's given freely to people. And I was wondering, besides just like the lost costs that utilities face, like what else would be like a consequence of viewing electricity as a right?
Yeah, so I think what we have to think about is, where do you have market failures? Where does the government need to step in to provide certain services, right? And I think it's largely, if you look at policy, all around the world, the idea of a universal service obligation is strong and pretty consistent everywhere. That a lot of households are very difficult to reach remotely, and the market on its own may not have the incentive to reach people. So the provision of access to electricity, I think, can be considered an entitlement, but that it be free, I don't necessarily see a basis for that. So when you say a right to electricity, it's a question as to what you mean by that, right? If you mean that I should have the right to have the option of electricity service, I would say that's quite a lot of support for that claim. But to say that it needs to be free, I think begs the question as to what the basis for that is, right? And what is the broader condition of poverty that people are in? you may give free electricity and they may still spend 90% of their income on food, and you still have a highly deprived individual or household. So I don't think that's the right solution.
Just following up on that point, was curious to just hear a little more of your thoughts about, like, the distinction between energy poverty and being in the broader, and I guess just poverty more broadly. And when we're thinking about solutions, which of these solutions are really going to be through the form of energy services like mini grid connections versus broader poverty? I'm thinking of this just because I'm working this semester on mini grid projects, and there's this assumption for the business model to work that once you put it in place, people will be able to consume increasing amount of electricity because now they have access and maybe can start businesses or things like that. From your graph, it didn't really look like that's historically been the case, but I guess I'd be curious if you think there are good places where really the solution to energy poverty really is through energy, better service, versus where we really need kind of a broader economic kind of toolkit.
Yeah, that's a really pertinent question. And I would say that this is a very well-known problem. In fact, today, funders make it a requirement for funding. A lot of funders, I don't know about all, a lot of funders make it a requirement for supporting mini grid solutions for energy access that they demonstrate demand stimulation. That part of their solution and their, the value proposition needs to include how they're going to generate future demand for electricity. Because that would be the purpose of providing electricity, as I've been saying, is to generate the ability to enjoy energy services. So, I've spoken to, I was recently on a panel with someone, a CEO of a company in Africa that has had to demonstrate income generation activities from the provision of mini grids. And so she was showing us how women's income in those villages that they set up mini grids has increased in the last few years from the provision of the grid. So that is well known that we need to do that. Now, to what extent it needs to be supported by government and what extent it's laissez-faire, that's a difficult question. What subsidies should the government provide? Because like I'm saying here, it's not clear as to what level is necessary, because energy is not the only service they need to rise out of poverty. So you need to provide roads to people. You need to provide credit and credit markets so that they can finance a new piece of equipment that they can use to start a new business. And you have to look at all of that holistically. And frankly, we really don't know. There is no theoretical guidance, for how to go about this. And so it's generally pretty ad hoc. So the World Bank tends to have a lot of influence here, and they tend to, have rules of thumb that may or may not be justified. For example, it's 10% of income spent on energy, for example, right? Or the cost of supply that they claim should only be cheaper than the next best alternative, which is extremely expensive, like diesel, right? So unfortunately, I can't give a clear answer, but certainly it is the case that even electricity providers today are required to think about and demonstrate the impact of the service on poverty more broadly.
In terms of clean cooking, at the moment, what would you say that, let's say, policymakers in India feel is the greatest challenge in moving from an LPG-focused approach towards an electric-focused approach?
Well, electricity has been extremely unreliable and persistently so. The demand it would place on the grid, the increase in peak demand, would be substantial. It would increase people's consumption of electricity by an order of magnitude, literally, if you were to adopt an electric stove in addition to your cell phone charger and your 3 LED bulbs, right? So that's why it's too much of a, and in fact, as you know, in my lab, one of my students is thinking about looking at electric cook stove field experiment. And we're learning already that the requirements in the household for the electricity connection, safe connection and other things is already prohibitive for a lot of homes. So there's a lot of challenges with electricity for cooking. But I do think that is in the end the long-term solution. There's also a political economy around gas, right? So that's also why LPG is favored. We've had a tremendous increase in the uptake of LPG. There've been a lot of success stories around the world with LPG. Places where gas is readily available, Northern Africa, Indonesia, they've had great success with LPG. And in cities, they set up distribution systems as they have in the US. And so that is really, and if you can then decarbonize the gas, it is a viable solution potentially. So it's a big open debate still. I don't think there's not enough research that's been done really to assess them against each other. Yeah.
Time for one more question in the open session.
Hi, are there any models similar to this graph that include, because this says that the red dotted line is the current decent living energy provision needed. Are there any models that take into account climate change and how that's gonna impact the energy demanded for like air conditioning or heating or things like that?
Yeah, great question. We are doing that analysis. And so we focusing on heating and cooling, and mainly cooling because we're focusing on the global south. So yeah, we have projections of energy demand, requirements in future scenarios of climate change, but really the bulk of the energy growth is from people just getting any service at all. And the increment from the climate change in the future as a share of the total energy that's going to be required just to provide any cooling at all today is actually quite small. But of course, in certain pockets, certain areas, it could be dramatic, but by and large, overall, it's not going to push up that black line very significantly. But it's a good question. And it affects other dimensions as well. Like I haven't talked at all about food and nutrition, but food insecurity is a tremendous problem. And even today in this Ukraine situation, people aren't really thinking about the dependence of developing countries on fertilizer and gas for fertilizer that's in some cases coming from Russia. And so the food system is going to be affected significantly by climate change as well. And how that affects energy is an open question that would need to be studied.